Over the years, our kids have had a lot of illnesses. 6 kids means a lot of childhood sniffles and coughs. And when our kids weren't feeling well, it affected our entire home. Luckily, some clever guys in Brisbane have come up with the perfect solution: Rehydrate.
Rehydrate are delicious drinks that rehydrate up to 3 times faster than water alone, packed with essential electrolytes. Rehydrate is one of the few rehydration products that is safe for all ages. Stock up at Coles and be prepared whenever illness strikes.
All timeout, like all punitive consequences, is never going to help children develop. We have to find a way of working with children instead of doing things to them.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now.
Well, we're not going to mess around at all today. We're straight into it. This is a conversation that I am looking so much forward to. By the way, my name's Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the author of 6 books about raising happy families. My wife and podcast partner is Kylie. We're the parents of 6 kids.
If you've been listening over the last few weeks, you'll have heard some amazing really amazing discussions we've had with Alfie Kohn. I think he's becoming one of my favourites.
He's been my favourite for 20 years and you're finally saying to him, like, hello.
Well, we had a great conversation with him around punishment and reward.
The research is very clear. Rewards, like punishments, can only get temporary compliance, and in both cases, they retard moral and social and intellectual development.
If you've missed those, make sure you go back and have a listen.
Check
it's
them out.
Really well worth it. But today, we've got something awesome.
So a while back, I had a very uncomfortable, in fact, it was a very public disagreement with a psychology professor at a major university in Sydney. I won't mention the professor's name. I won't mention the university, but I will highlight this. He was staggeringly rude. He was extraordinarily aggressive because he didn't like my take on time out.
That's Anyway, let's carry on. Today, Alfie joins us to talk about the problem with time out. Alfie, the 3rd time you've spoken with us, we're so grateful.
Happy to do it.
Okay, so Alfie, let's dive straight in. I'm going to ask, as if I'm brand new to the topic and have never heard anything about it before, because I want everybody to hear your take. What is wrong with time out?
First of all, it's interesting to look at where the phrase came from. What's the history of it? And I'll be very brief here. But timeout was developed in the laboratories of B.F. Skinner. You know, most people will know, I hope, who I'm talking about, an American psychologist who did most of his research with rodents and pigeons and wrote most of his books about people. B.F. Skinner and his acolytes ended up training rats to run through mazes and to press bars, pigeons to peck at discs, and so on. And instead of just trying to control their behavior with reinforcers, usually food, they would sometimes have a time out from positive reinforcement. That was the original phrase, which means we're going to stop giving you the food for a while to punish you, or time out from light and plunge the animals into darkness to see if that would extinguish the behaviors that the researchers didn't want, the people with the power. And by the way, over the years that I've been writing and thinking about this, the one thing is clear to me is praise and rewards, just like punishments, are really about power. People with more of it controlling people with less of it. That's what lurks underneath every treacly, good job, every sticker and star. It's about me making you do what I want. So instead of using physical violence on children, which apart from being a moral abomination turns out to be massively counterproductive, any kind of slapping or spanking teaches children to hurt others when they want to get something done. So there are actually therapists and pediatricians who will say, don't spank kids, use a timeout.
Well, they're not just therapists and pediatricians, Alfie. The American Psychological Association, the APA, has psychiatric. I can't remember if it's the psychiatric or psychological, but the major body over there in the United States has come out and explicitly said that they're now against spanking, or in Australia we would call it smacking, but they have explicitly stated that they would encourage parents to be using time out. So we've got a peak body in charge of psychology and looking after these kinds of things, saying that time out is the way to go. Obviously, the history of it is that this is about removing children from positive reinforcement, but you and I both argue strongly not to do it.
Becomes, when I saw that it was, in fact, if you look up in the psychological literature, timeout is listed under the category of love withdrawal. And that's when the light bulb turned on for me over my head. Because I was thinking, what positive reinforcement? It's not like we're handing out candy bars to kids all day long. They do something bad and we say, time out, no candy bar for 10 minutes. What's the positive reinforcement that we're shutting down? It's our love. Yeah. And that's how young children experience it. And that is absolutely horrifying. And this connects to what you and I talked about in both of our last two sessions. First, timeout, which is actually more accurately called forcible isolation of young children, is a way of doing things to them rather than working with them, about appealing to naked power to make them unhappy on purpose in the hope that will change their behavior, which, as I argued a couple weeks ago, the only thing that can ever get is temporary compliance, but at an enormous cost, a cost to their ethical development and a cost to our relationship, because now kids come to see us pretty much the same way as they're about as happy to see us as we would be to see a police car in our rear view mirrors. We're not a caring ally to help them through a problem they're having. Now we're someone who has the capacity to make them unhappy if we don't please them. That's what every timeout does, is further rupture our relationship, and from a very practical point of view, our capacity to solve the problem. That's why timeout, like all other punishments and rewards, are not just ineffective, they actually do damage. And the other thing that we talked about more recently is the other feature of timeout, which is that it communicates the conditionality of our love. It says, I love you, care for you, want to spend time with you only when you meet my standards, only when you do what I demand. Otherwise, you are literally cast off from me, and figuratively, I'm casting you off at the same time, which is devastating for a child. So when you talk of, you and I were chatting before about a psychologist who believes that under some circumstances with impossibly fine distinctions of what problem had led to it and how long we do it and so on, sort of like titrating this for the the fine tuning of when to do timeout and for how long and what they have to do to earn their way back into our presence and so on. All of this is like talking about different types of wood you should use on the paddle when you hit a child. It misses the big picture here, which is that all timeout, like all punitive consequences, is never going to help children develop in the way that we want to, that we have to find a way of working with children instead of doing things to them.
Alfie, can you just unpack that idea around using love as a positive reinforcement versus using punishment and timeout?
The whole idea of punishing children, deliberately making them unhappy to change their behavior, and then second, as well, communicating the conditionality of our affection and our love when what they need is to be loved for who they are, never for what they do. They should never have to earn our affection. Suggests that this is another example of how many people miss the forest for the trees, focus too much on the details, don't take a step back and say, the whole practice is grounded in something problematic. No version of that old-style, traditional bribe and threat approach, including timeout, will ever be effective if by effective you mean a child who can think for herself, a child who is genuinely concerned about the well-being of others, even when there's nothing in it for her, a child who is able to communicate effectively, to trust, respect, and be respected, a child who is happy. The more ambitious your goals are for your children, the more you should run from any version of time out or other versions of rewards and punishments.
Alfie Kohn is our guest on our podcast today. We're going to continue our chat with Alfie in just a sec.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Are screens creating tension at home? Tweens, Teens and Screens is a webinar to guide families to healthy, safe super screen solutions. Buy it today at happyfamilies.com.au/shop.
It's the Happy Families Podcast with Justin and Kylie Coulson. Today's guest, Alfie Kohn, the author of Punished by Rewards, Unconditional Parenting, and a whole range of other books. It's so good to be talking with you again, Alfie.
You bet.
So, Alfie, we've been talking about time out and how it's linked to controlling our kids. But I'm thinking about these parents who are with us today and just wondering, what am I supposed to do with a child who just won't do what I ask? What is one simple tip that you would suggest to give these parents reassurance that they've actually got this, they can do it?
Yeah.
I need to know whether it's worth doing. As I said in our last conversation, much of the time, not all of the time, but much of the time, instead of asking, how do I get kids to do this if I can't use bribes and threats, the problem is not with the kids' refusal. The problem is with the inappropriateness of what we're asking kids to do, and the fact that it may be more for our convenience than for helping because the child needs it or will benefit from it. And then some version of eliciting from kids their experience and figuring out, even if they can't tell us in words yet, why they're acting the way they do. Because if kids are shrieking, if they're reacting in a way that we find very disturbing and annoying, it's often because that's the only way they have of communicating their understandable pain or resistance. Our job, and by the way, this is something I didn't say in our past two conversations, but what we have to do is move beyond behavior. I have this little rule of thumb, which is that the value of a resource for parents, which would include a podcast, an article, a book, a lecture, the value of a resource for parents is inversely proportional to the number of times it contains the word behavior.
I think this is the first time we've used that word in 3 conversations. I'm feeling good about this.
Yes. Right, good on us. But the point is that that's not true for most people who focus on that. What defined B.F. Skinner as a behaviorist wasn't just his use of reinforcers to control pigeons or children. It's the fact that he literally believed there is nothing to us other than behaviors that you can see and measure. The more you believe that's true, and you go to your pediatrician, you go to your therapist or whatever and say, how do I deal with my child's behavior or misbehavior? It's called misbehavior when the more powerful person doesn't like it. How do I deal with the behavior? You're already lost because the answer is almost always going to be some version of a bribe or a threat.
So much better to say, how do I help my child? How do I understand my child? How do I work with my child?
What matters are the needs, the values, the goals that underlie and inform the actions. Because when you're talking about a kid's behavior as being problematic, you're probably going to fall back on a reward or a punishment, which can temporarily buy you a different behavior. But you've lost your child when you're looking at only the behavior on the surface. What I call a working with approach, which begins with the complete cessation of all rewards and punishments. A working with approach will play out differently depending on the child and the situation and you. But it will always be about looking underneath the behavior at the child, him or herself.
Alfie, the last question, because our time is far spent. Would you agree that it is appropriate from time to time to say, we're all a little bit emotional right now and none of us are dealing well with this situation? We need to have some, and I'm using the word intentionally now, we need to have some time out to recalibrate and to reorient ourselves so that we can deal with this situation more effectively.
As long as you're not projecting your need onto the child and pretending the child feels that way when the child doesn't and only you do, with that caveat, I would say, sure, some time apart to be by myself, each of us, and calm down, take a breath, think about stuff. Yeah, that can be a very useful anger management tool, but it's critical. What distinguishes a useful anger management tool from a rather cruel punishment is whether the child has control. If you invite the child to go to his bedroom and we can both calm down, that's fine. The child must be able to decide where to go, what to do there, when to come back. If that's out of the child's hands, then it's not a useful anger management tool.
It's become a punishment. Yeah, spot on. There have been many times, Alfie, where I've looked at my children and said, I'm not coping with this very well. I'm going to send myself to my room until I can come out and behave like an adult. And that's worked just fine because it was about me. It wasn't about them.
Yep.
Great talking to you. For people who want to find out more, we'll add all the links to your books and to your wonderful resources in our show notes. Thank you so much for your generous conversation.
Thank you.
Well, such a great conversation. A really big thank you again, Alfie. Really appreciate your time. And if you missed out, we have 2 other conversations with Alfie on punishment and rewards and unconditional parenting. So make sure that you have a listen to them. We really hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you do enjoy the podcast, can you visit Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and review, a 5-star review and rating, if you don't mind. We really appreciate those because when you do that, it helps other people to find the podcast and have happier families. Oh, by the way, some news about that I'm going to tell you about tomorrow. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Thank you very much, Justin. And our executive producer is Craig Bruce. If you'd like more info about how we can help your families to flourish, you can find all the information on our Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families, or at happyfamilies.com.au.